Welcome to Other Lands Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Boss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hi, welcome to the Other Lands Editing Podcast. This is Margaret, and I'm here as always with Midnight. We will be talking about some different things this week, but first, before we get into our main discussion, I wanted to let you all know we'll be teaching a forum class in mid-December into January about how to write holiday stories. It means other holidays, not just like seasonal winter holidays, but also looking at Halloween stories and tying it into other types of holidays that are popular, sometimes like Valentine's Day. And if you want to get information about how to sign up for that class, which will be hosted through groups.io, you can email us at info@otherlands-editing.com. That's info@otherlands-editing.com. But for right now, it's been a few weeks. So, Midnight, you want to tell us what we're talking about today?
Sure. Today we are going to start talking about religion. And since we are editors, it is mostly from the world building perspective, but current events are, I think, what prompted us to start discussing this. So, what was happening that made you think that we should jump in?
Well, it was a little bit odd, and I've watched enough videos on this to see that the rapture and quote rapture talk became very popular on TikTok because I think some South African preacher kind of ran a little bit of, let's be honest, an online grift saying the rapture from Revelation and end times and Christian theology was going to happen. First, they had it was going to happen, I think, in the middle to end of September to kind of go around Yom Kippur. But then they're like, well, maybe it's the Julian calendar, and somehow God got confused with the calendar. So it might be like the 6th of October. But since we're recording this on the 4th of November, you can tell that as far as we can see, the rapture didn't happen. But it
Yeah,
got me thinking about how each religion obviously is going to have in real life or in fiction its own world building, its own tenets, its own beliefs. But in general, the subset of especially American Christians who believe in our evangelical fundamentalist in like a literal rapture and have what they call that eschatology of belief of how the end times are going to happen is one of the more interesting types of world building and lack of like coherence in it. Because, most of this is stuff I've got from watching people analyze the Left Behind movies, and I mean the ones with Kirk Cameron from like the 90s that were direct to DVD. I'm actually was a Methodist, so we weren't deep into this is what's going to happen in the end times, and there'll be giant locust people who'll eat you, which is actually in Revelation if you read it. But one of the things I found so odd is, especially you'd see it on Rapture Talk, they'd get obsessed with little things that kind of didn't make sense. Like, if you're going to get raptured, make sure you're wearing your nice clothes, because according to the way it's set up in Left Behind, which I think became enmeshed with actual beliefs on the rapture, is that your body will physically get raptured, but your clothes won't get raptured. So you'll float into heaven essentially naked, but you'd be
heaven is a
embarrassed.
nudist colony.
Yeah, you get embarrassed if your clothes got left behind, if you didn't have the nicest underwear on or whatever. But A, why can't your spirit just like ascend? Why does it have to be your physical body? That's a little random. But also, do you care if you've already ascended to paradise? What does it matter what sinners you think are going to be in perdition forever? Think about the clothes you were wearing the day you ascended. Or, okay, extrapolating from that, if you really believe we're living in the end times, and we might ascend at any moment, or the rapture's just around the corner because these people kept moving the goalpost. Why would you even have pets or children? Because what happens if you like raptured but they didn't? And they literally had people who gave their children away, at least two cases. The CPS, which is in the United States, stands for Child Protective Services, in case they got raptured but their kids got left behind. And I'm like, A, what kind of God wouldn't let kids go to heaven? B, why did you raise your kids in such a way that you thought they were going to get excluded? And more often, C, did you just kind of look for an excuse to get your kids out from underfoot, then realize the raptures didn't happen on either date, and now you're trying to get in legal battles to get them back? But all those weird little inconsistencies that don't make a lot of sense even within that own setup of the eschatology for Christian end times. Maybe think about how religion, even in real life, can be poorly world built. So that's why I
Well,
brought
and
that
as you've
idea to you.
mentioned before, like a lot of this stuff is not ancient in any way. It's very recent to their, I'm going to call this part of it mythology. I'm not have a problem with that because they've started building it from a fiction series. So it's not even as though they have this ancient text and they're the people of the book and they're following this. It's that these stuff got added within the past couple of decades. And then the part about the rapture was also quite late in adding into this system of belief. I think that you'd mentioned it in the sometime in the 1800s. Is that accurate or
Yeah,
was it earlier?
yeah, the idea that built on the eschatology of like there'll be 7 years of tribulation and looking for the signs is really something that came in with revivalist preachers in the 1840s. And then what you think of the architecture of the emphasis, especially on the end times with an antichrist, which is mentioned in Revelation, that is true, but
Yeah.
the obsessive like emphasis and looking for it was there. And they would say things like in the 80s, like it's going to be Ayatollah this or whatever, or Saddam Hussein back when he was still running Iraq. But at the same time, this really ramped up because in the 90s they had that made for DVD series and the Left Behind books were very popular. They were also co-written between a minister and a failed romance novelist. So it's if you feel like if you've ever read them that they're super pulpy and super purple in their prose, that's why. The provenance is definitely there in the way it's written. And some things that you'll see people extrapolate today in 2020 really feels like it comes just lifted from either having seen that as a kid in Sunday school as a movie or had to read that or the spin-off Left Behind series for teens. And it's like a telephone of a telephone of a telephone game where maybe the original Hebrew scripts existed, then you have the revelation in the Christian Bible. Then, Reformed preachers in the 1840s have these ideas to facilitate revivals, and somehow it bled into Left Behind. And now, like 8 iterations down, it's the fodder for TikTok videos. But a lot of it seems to be coming from a fictional book series of the 1980s and early 90s. And it's confusing and it's muddled. At this point, you're right, mythology, because it's based really more on a book than it is on the good book.
Yeah, it's strange. And we say this all the time about current events as you have to make fiction more realistic than what we're currently living through. And I think that's true of religions as well, is that you both have to make them more realistic and logically coherent, but at the same time recognize how messy and complicated religion can be for people.
And one thing is we're throwing around the term religion, but how, especially since you're the world building side and expert of our little team, but how do you define a religion? Like, what is a religion anyway?
I think I define it mostly what it does rather than what it is. So I think of it in a couple of different ways, and then we can delve into parts of those. That I think of it first as an organizing principle for your values, and you can talk about what that means in a minute, what
Mhm.
values are, as well as a signal of what's important to your characters and a set source of conflict for the different takes on those values. So functionally, you ask, what does religion do when you start creating a religion? And how does that adhere to what they care about, etc.?
Yeah, and when you say the word values, like there's a lot of psychological meaning behind that. There's literary meaning behind that. I've done some research at grad school on it. But I like to think of it in a very simple way to say, like, values guiding what one ought to do. And each group or sector, even a person who has personal values, are only going to have a set of two or three, maybe four on the outside that are the top values that guide your priorities. And the reason I say that is, say you're someone who you put a lot of value on something like egalitarianism, where there's a lot of fairness and there's a lot of equal distribution on who has a say in society and a round table ideal of every voice gets heard. You're not going to also at the same time value hierarchy or strict control in a society
Yeah.
because it's going to be at odds with you wanting to be an egalitarian, for good or ill, hippie type person. And I think people want to have a lot of values. It's kind of also like when you have a lot of New Year's resolutions, you can only make one or two things that priority for yourself. So depending on the religion or the sect really of that religion, what they're going to put their value and priority on isn't always going to be the same as sister like denominations, let alone
Yeah.
other very disparate religions. You're going to have to pick and choose what really matters to your religion, what you're standing for, and how you practice it as well.
Yeah, so then we take that into what we actually see on the page would be how it structures our social behaviors. Okay, everyone cares about family, I guess. But then what does the family look like? And what do we do with the old people? And what are the ways that we treat the earth around us according to those values and what we put that on? And additionally, I'm just going to add this on because I have my students read Parable of the Sower. If you're comparing the kind of Christianity we were talking about, not any other version, that particular kind, and Earthseed from Parable of the Sower, then it tells you what it means to even be alive in the world and what our purpose is here. So for the evangelical Christianity that is specifically focused on the rapture, their value is on the other world and not this world. Their value is on leaving this world to be in heaven. Whereas if you read Parable of the Sower, their focus is very much on this world, even though they think they're going to go to space at some point. They are going to go to space. It happens in the books, but their focus is so much on how we treat people in the present and how we organize society to make best use of what they have to anticipate disaster because they're living in a dystopian nightmare.
Yeah,
So,
and I was gonna say, I know we keep bringing up it was the source of it for Rapture Talk and that set of fundamentalist evangelical, the end times are coming. I'd also like to make a note that my family's from North Carolina, so I grew up with my very, very staunch believing daughter of a Baptist minister aunt. So it's also kind of like culture I've been either raised around or have an insight into. So it's also like a for right now a critique of that culture, but that notice of if you're calling it the great getting up morning and you're looking forward to ascending to a new plane, you kind of see this as the way station or the purgatory you have to be until your real spiritual life starts. You're not going to treat the planet or people here as well as you could because they're not the priority.
yeah, it's a set of
And
priorities, as you
yeah,
said, of what do we value? Maybe you sort of casually value the earth, but if you're a this world focused religion, then you're going to value it so much more. You're going to put so much more into shaping what's going on around you. And Earthseed in particular is so focused on activism and change because it's based off the idea that we've known about climate change forever. Butler started researching it in the 70s.
yeah.
So that concept of people just let things get worse and worse, and they have, it shapes the religion of you need to be active in anticipating problems and trying to correct them. But if your belief is that we're going to be out of here pretty soon, then why would you need to correct those problems, really?
I think that really does inform what your characters are going to value and how they're going to react. So someone who like within that religion, within Butler's work, is really active in doing the work and doing the activism at home and the community care, that's important to them. But if they were to brush up against someone in that book, and I don't know if that happens, I haven't read it yet, who is from a different thing, like a evangelical who's like, well, it's time to get going, or I don't have to worry about that, or eventually I'm just gonna have an afterlife. Like they're gonna have
Yeah.
different priorities because they're gonna believe different things are gonna matter.
I mean, it is kind of the first half of the book because she starts as a teenager and she comes from a Southern Baptist household and her father's the
Hmm.
Reverend. So the community is very much, well, eventually things will get back to normal, but they never do a lot to do that. It takes a lot to even get them to put out a night watch. So people are very resistant to taking action to help themselves in any way. They've got this sense of learned helplessness because things have been bad for so long. It's partially religious and partially just like apathy and learned helplessness, but that's a little tangential to what we're talking about. Then they do in the next book come up against Christo-fascists, which is an entirely different piece of
Yes.
bread and butter. So let's let them go. Another
But I
way that
think
you
you
think
can,
about religion is think about how they perceive the world and what they think is wrong with it or what it needs to do. So if they're not just discarding the world entirely, what about the world changes how they envisioned what God is and what the world should be through their practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I can only speak to my input. Full
Yeah,
disclaimer, right now I'm an agnostic at best, but I was raised as a Methodist here in Maryland, which is a northern state technically, but the ethos is very much within the Methodist Church in the north at least, is faith, but also good works and this genuine want to like
yeah,
help others where they are in our communities and also do the mission trip type stuff, but also really look at who do we help here and sustain on a regular basis. Because if we're living our faith, then we're doing the works that would reflect a Christ-like life. And
yeah,
that
yeah,
to me is something that within religion, even though I'm not religious anymore, I valued because I felt like if they're really willing to be there and in community now, and if community looks like helping the least of us, then that mattered to me. And I thought that was supposed to matter because I thought that was the red text in the New Testament and what Jesus wanted to be done. It's not proselytizing as much as just saying, from my perspective, with the one religion I dealt with and was a part of, for me, that meant fixing the world by starting with our fellow man, starting with people in our hometown, starting with who needs extra food for the food drive, which is very pertinent right now, but was always on our minds. Who needs extra help with starting a tutoring center? Who needs, you know, Toys for Tots this year because they're just not in our own congregation or in our own backyard, not going to be able to have toys for their kids this year. So, at least from the Northern Methodist ethos, it was how do we help those in our backyard, especially to like have a safer, more provided for life, even if it's little baby steps? And what can you do day to day to help your neighbor? But I know that would be different from other religions who may feel like X needs fixing or Y needs fixing. And I don't want to extrapolate on everybody else's sect or religion, but
yeah. I mean, I think, okay, on one note of that, that sort of ties into how the religion tells you what to look for authority or guidance within the religion itself. We can talk about a little bit more about the structure in a minute, but the concept of I need to live a Christ-like lifestyle, as in I need to help the poor and the community in the way that Christ would, that shows those values in there. But additionally, along those lines of the what does the world look like, I think the easiest way to look at this from polytheistic view is just to go back to ancient Greece, where they will tell you that the world was kind of chaotic and therefore the gods were kind of chaotic and personal.
that's a
And when
nice
you
way to
get
put
these,
Zeus.
uh,
Chaotic. Oh, yeah.
um, I mean, not all of them are insane, but Arachne did get turned into a spider for having an attitude. So, like, there's a lot going on there. And if you look to older pantheons, then it may be because there are parts of the world you don't understand yet, or there are things that need explaining of like, why is it like this? And then they put these things in there that will help contextualize what's going on as well as forward those values. And then Greece in particular is interesting for this because they did have a large pantheon, but then you would have specific cities that would just, not even countries, like specific cities would be like, this is the one. This is the one from the pantheon that we're going to honor specifically.
I mean,
And
how
then
do you
they
think
have
you
a
got
whole
Athens,
mythology about
Greece?
why Athens took Athena instead of Poseidon. So the two of them don't like each other that much because Athena won.
I was just saying, it made me think about like, yeah, you have Athena or you have the Temple at Delphi, or you'll have ones that are made to Apollo. And it's interesting that it could be in that personal a level of I'll take my city states God, not even like you're right, sort of a loose conglomeration of states to make a country, but like this is our city state God. You came into our territory and now Athena has say, or over here Apollo has say, which is a different way to think about it because we're so used for most of us because quite the most sort of prodigious, or I guess the more prominent religions right now are kind of in this cousin situation. I mean, the three biggest ones that people think of, even though population-wise, Judaism isn't as large as Christianity and Islam, but we're all kind of brothers that don't get along all that great sometimes within the,
Yeah.
Abrahamic faith of the same Yahweh, God, all is all the same one deity. So I think it's interesting to think back to where you have these polytheistic cultures. And I'm not saying we don't, I'm just saying I'm not as familiar with Hinduism and its polytheism as,
Yeah, I
some people
wouldn't
are with
speak
other
to it.
things. Yeah,
But if you
but I think
wanted to
it's
research it, then you would learn a lot about how polytheistic religions can continue to work even through the modern world. I just use the examples of the ancient world because it's a little easier not to step on any toes. So,
exactly. But for me, it's interesting because I am coming from like originally a monotheistic faith to think back to how in ancient Greek they literally had patrons for their own town that were like a god that they kind of picked, which is at least here in the Western world, in the United States, in Maryland, and today in time, it's just more interesting thing. Like this, it could be Mary's hometown. This could be Joseph. You know what I mean? Like it's not quite a one to
yeah.
one, but it's different in our way
And it,
because we don't have that tradition currently in the United States.
if you think about, so like my history is essentially that my parents weren't particularly religious. My mom was Mormon for a little while, but not practicing while I was growing up. But they did take us to churches, and then at some point we went to a Southern Baptist church, and then I fell out of that and became an eclectic neo-pagan. So, in the concept of polytheism in the modern world, eclectic neo-paganism is incredibly personal to your particular feelings about something and choosing your sets of gods that you feel relate to what you value in the world. So that's, I don't know, it's just, I don't know what to say about that with regards to world building, but it is a reflection of we do still have that potential for something to be so personal, but it's different because we're not as cohesive geographically.
Yeah. But I think what you're pointing out and what I hear as someone listening to you speak is that there is this personal aspect in religion. I know that should be very self-evident, especially if you are a religious person, it motivates your daily life. But I think when I read, and I don't read fantasy as much as you do, it's fantasy is not necessarily always my thing. But I think when I read ones that are poorly written, because I am an editor, so I pick up ones that don't quite hit the
Yeah,
mark, you get religions that it feels like it isn't personal. And I'm going to put a pin in this for 1 second, but I'll come back to this one idea that's in my head.
yeah,
But you get this kind of, it's a blanket, it's a religion, this is what you do. It almost becomes the same way that maybe you read a book that's high fantasy with world building that's not thought out well enough, and the same thing kind of applies to the government or country structures. This is country A, this is country B, this one's, got a dictator, this one's all democracy, and it's all very like real basic. The lines are just barely painted in. And I get that feeling a lot of the times when I read something where it is a fantasy or a romantasy and there are different religions, but the work hasn't been put in. So it feels like even the main character, it's a concept of like, oh, my family over there has that. We've got a temple. I'll talk about vaguely the gods or to the gods, but it's not
yeah.
really personal to the character themselves or part of their journey. It doesn't have to be, but when I find when they don't have a personal opinion or take or relationship to it, it's just this abstract concept in passing, it feels one dimensional.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Of that, there are a couple of tells that you haven't really put a lot of thought into their belief system, and one is just saying by the gods and having literally no names
Hmm.
for any of them. Then the second part is of having a monoculture in a way that which is the part where you have to both be more cohesive in creating the religion, but also realistic in that people have different feelings about that religion, and even within the same country, they're going to practice differently.
Yeah, I was going back to the thing I put a pin in was I heard this in church growing up was it's not a religion, it's a relationship. Like what is your relationship with Christ, which can be an old song you can chuckle at a little bit if you've grown on from the church or aren't in it any longer. But it is still true that if religion is going to feel like it has a texture, it has something that's important to your character or is worth mentioning and developing it all in your book, then the character has to have some kind of relation to it, relation to perhaps their personal sector religion. Maybe it's not the dominant culture's religion. Maybe it is. Maybe they practice it in a way different from their family. Maybe they don't. Maybe they get very into the way it may intersect with politics or the way their country or territory is run. Maybe they don't. Maybe they like it. Maybe, but like, what is their personal reflection on it? And how does having that religion or having more specifically, honestly, that sect within a greater religion, because every religion has its own sects and it's hard word to say because I know it sounds like I'm saying something else,
Yeah.
but like their own sects and denominations and then traditions within those little itty bitty denominations and the granular side of it. And if you just paint it with a broad stroke and then you don't really show how it affects the character's inner life, then you could almost not have mentioned it at all. And that's the thing we're trying to seek in world building is where if it's going to be put on the page, it needs to at least affect and have some influence within the character's life and how they react to it, or it doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, and the larger the group gets, the more variable it's going to be. So if you have 10 people who are kind of traveling through the apocalypse, then they're probably going to have a more cohesive set of beliefs than 100 people. And once you start moving this further and further out, then that's when you start having differences in opinion about what one thing or the other means, and then fractures within that. The polytheistic religions tend to be less centralized in power, and that's one of the reasons that you have so many different focus points with gods. And it's easier, historically speaking, that you allow others to slip in. Like you'll have main gods and but then local gods. And then, as you've mentioned to me before, if you study history at all, you know that the Christians were able to just talk to polytheistic people as they were there, and they're like, "Oh, your gods are real, but they're saints." It's sort of adopting whatever's around, of like, sure, this too. But then you have the monotheistic religions that do tend to be more hierarchical. They tend to be less accepting of variation, but there's still going to be variation, or we wouldn't have had the Reformation.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think that's the thing I like to point out is if you think, you've got how successful they were at converting great swaths of the planet. And one of the places that because I took a lot of Spanish and studied a lot of Latin American history, is they were very successful in getting Catholicism spread very widely through Central and South America. And one of the ways they did it is they kind of were like, well, yeah, Mary, she's like, Aymara, you're a Pachamama. She's like this, you know, indigenous groups goddess, and sort of letting that graft happen. And then they got to be able, you can keep your feast days, but technically you're doing it to an iteration of Mary. The other thing with Catholicism, and you brought up the Reformation, is that it splits into Protestantism, but there's still ostensibly, on paper, if it's not really well mapped out, there's still ostensibly religions to the same God, the same Trinity, yada, yada. But then you can see how so much tension just between Catholicism and general Protestantism affected the Western world, affected Europe. Bloody Mary got her name from being a Catholic queen who was out to destroy any closet Protestants or any Protestants who weren't worshiping and taking the Eucharist in the right way, whether they believed transubstantiation was literal body of Christ or not, caused tons of death in like 1560s England. Or even if you're like not thinking of examples that far away, the troubles in Northern Ireland between Catholic and Protestant sects within Northern Ireland back in the 90s. You would think on paper, okay, well, they both believe in the same God, the same Holy Ghost, the same Jesus. It shouldn't be that different, but it really can be. And then if you think about greater differences between different religions and not just sects or denominations. But I think people forget that it doesn't have to be polar opposite. You don't have to have like a polytheistic religion over here on one side and a very rigid monotheistic patriarchal religion on the other for there to be divisions and fights and infighting. You could have it within your own different denominations of your one, in our case, like patriarchal monotheistic religion. Like I think people forget that there can be conflict even with not that much variation, which is very
yeah.
true in real life, but you don't see it as much in the fictional world.
I mean, if you talk the Reformation OG style, a lot of it was an argument over who had authority in the religion and who was able to say what. Of one of the reasons it took off is that the local kings were not super happy that they had to share power with the Pope. But another was it that we had the printing press finally. The East had it earlier. They had printing earlier than we did.
Of
But
course.
we got those two things going on, and then you had someone questioning of like, why are you going so far away from the book? Why is the book not the authority? Why are we not looking at that as the authority? Why are you able to do these things? Shouldn't we be able to interpret this ourselves as one of the several points? Because corruption was also part of it. But it is questioning that authority and completely fractured the church as a second time. There are multiple fractures in the history of Christianity. But so even over like simple definitions of at one point they were doing it in Latin, but then why can't we look at this ourselves and determine for ourselves and base it off of what the scripture tells us and not this deep canon lore that has been created alongside it. And like as you say, it can be even smaller divisions as you go along. And it's because people can't get along. And once religion reaches a certain point, it feels like it means so much more because it's what you put your faith in. So, and the way that you believe that the world works and the way that people should behave.
Yeah, and I think you keep coming back in our notes we've talked about before is like the idea of who are the gatekeepers. So with the schism between Protestantism and Catholicism, and this is becoming more of a history class than I thought, but religion does
Sorry.
trace history because religion shapes history. That's how we've reacted to it because different religious bodies have been able to change who gets colonized, who has the power, and who doesn't. In this case of gatekeeper, I was thinking about so much of that was in part about intercessory prayer and can you like actually talk to God if you want to, or do you have to go through and go to confessional and have the priest be your
Yeah.
intermediary? And that's a level of power of your soul can't even, if you are adherent to that religion, have that ability to transgress and transcend to theoretically paradise unless you've paid the coffer and you've done the usury and you've adhered to what the priest told you to do so that they can literally talk to God in your stead, or you want to have a more direct relationship, which is kind of part of the cornerstone of Protestantism.
Yeah.
Part of
Yeah.
it outside of Luther is also King Henry really wanted to get divorced a lot, so the Anglican Church got
And
started.
Christianity is not the only religion that had a sect break off because
Mm-mm,
they
no.
wanted to have a more personal relationship with their monotheistic God. Sufism is an example, I believe, that you would take from uh, outside of what we've been focusing on because it's just so easy to look at specific examples of big breaks. If you wanted to learn more about how to write religion, start easy. YouTube, Heimler's history, start looking through the things that they what happened. You're like, oh, okay. Uh, as you don't have to copy what other religions did, but you can get a sense of how religious conflicts shape things and then how religions change over time and how they get filtered through of you can have Buddhism start in India and then go through China and then end up in Japan, but only after it's filtered through Korea. And so then you have religion moving over large spaces and then changing to fit the population there because, again, it is all about values. Then they're going to project that onto their values. The religious tenets may shape them a little bit in turn, and then you get syncretism where things will come together between the local culture and the new information.
Yeah, and I think it becomes more complicated than just like, well, here's the gods. And I'm not trying to harp on that, but I've read a lot of fiction where it wasn't quite in the depth that needed to be to go live or go to prime time, where it still needed some thoughts on the developmental edit, where they had been like, well, there's the gods. And they don't say anything. They just use it as a phrase instead of saying, oh my God, they'll say, oh my God. So that's about as much
Yeah,
thought
they
as they
only,
put into their
I mean,
religion. It's
at
frustrating.
that point, it seems like they just want to make it sound a little more like fantasy.
Yeah.
And so, for good or ill, the assumption is, oh my God means Christian God. Not necessarily, but it's their attempt to say, oh, well, gods, that's done. And so, okay, but you also wouldn't do that if your God didn't have a prohibition against saying their name directly.
I think also with
It's, that's not something that would
gatekeepers,
happen.
you don't think you think about it as literal people sometimes, like I said, intercessory prayer, but literally, like,
Yeah,
and you mentioned it too, who decides what's canon, canon, where it's like, what are the actual liturgical books we're considering
yeah,
as part of our dogma and what was set aside? Because, like, I don't know if a lot of people know this. I'm sorry I keep contextualizing Christianity, but that's what I know from history class and from my own experience. But until the Nicene Council in the year 300 AD or
yeah,
something, where they figured out which books were going to go mostly into at the time, the Catholic Bible as you know it, and then what books are going to end up just in general, most Bibles as you're able to buy them over the stands nowadays or find them in your hotel room, thanks to the Gideons. But there are books that got thrown out. There's always been a lot of contesting about the validity of, are we even going to accept something like the Gospel of St. Thomas, which has anecdotes about the early life of Christ before he was 30, because there's kind of this blank period between like he was born and then he did his ministry. And are you going to accept some of that? Are you not? What about this book that was thrown out? Like what and who gets to say, nope, this is officially what we're studying and it's going to be part of our books, and who's going to say no? And even if you extrapolate out to Mormonism in the Book of Mormon, all of a sudden they're kind of like Christianity because they got the New Testament and the Old Testament, but then they've got the literal Book of Mormon, which is technically supposed to be about Jesus Christ in the New World and in, you know, Missouri, where the Garden of Eden is. And it is what it is. And that's where they go with it. But who's going to say which book gets kept and which doesn't? And that's a lot of power, too, to dictate what's going to be officially, air quotes, part of your religion.
It makes me think of how just one iteration later, and correct me if wrong on this, of like you move into Islam and they're like, yeah, all of that's fine, but this is the newest version. Like we're got the newest prophet, the most recent prophet. So this is the last testament instead of the one that you guys just did. Of like it just adds on from there, and that entire thing makes them, I don't know how to
Like the
put
newer
this.
kid on the block, or the one who's got the newest iteration because they've
Yeah,
added
the
the
newest
newest prophet.
revelation to
Yeah, that's
what's
it, the newest
happening, and it's
revelation.
from the same lineage of there's not as though they're saying, well, you're entirely wrong, but
Yeah,
just which text do we include? And then within Christianity, they can't decide which ones belong. Well, I guess they did decide, but then you have people still who will look at the additional texts. And if you're in
the
urban
Gnostic Gospels, that kind of
fantasy,
stuff.
then you
Yeah,
might as well look into the Gnostic stuff because then that's widely drawn on in horror and urban fantasy so that they
yeah,
have something to talk about. Um,
yeah, because you find actual mentions of the demonic side of stuff not as mentioned as you think in the actual biblical text. Even within Revelation, it's not as much as you think you're gonna get. I reread it recently and I was like, huh, it's kind of brief. Okay, now we're done. I think there's a lot of control in religion that people may not think about when designing their own, about
yeah,
even who gets to say what's followed as like a spiritual leader or priest or imam, etc., but also what gets to be followed because it's part of our hymns, it's part of our book of faith, it's part of our scrolls. There's a lot of deciding what gets picked or chosen over. It even, God bless them, even with Rod Serling when he really extrapolated, because the movie Planet of the Apes is super different from the French book, kind of transliterally titled Monkey Planet. I don't speak French, but that they have sacred scrolls and they have ones that are certainly applicable to certain scriptures and some that are kept only really within the defenders of the faith really read them and have access to them regularly. And it's really silly and it's kind of funny that's small. It's not a small footnote, but it's not the main part of the movie. But Rod Serling went out to think about like what would the lawkeeper have? What would that scroll be? Who would have access to it? Who would just pull it out to speak about it? Like there are just that idea of religion is a lot of times, not always, but in certain sects bastardized for control. And so the question becomes who sets all the precedents and who gets control to that information? And then how do they limit how others may or may not get it? If you think about
yeah,
Scientology, which is more cult, we'll talk more about cults in a minute or down the line. But with Scientology, it's very much about information control because at first, when you're doing your beginning auditing and thetan level readings, et cetera, and learning about the church, at least they were able to, before the internet and South Park, keep the upper level echelon stuff close to the vest and keep it closed down. Because, like, if you got in and started paying the money on day one, and they said this is all based on alien souls making you feel depressed because they were destroyed in volcanoes 75 million years ago, by Lord Zeno, you'd be like, I'm going to need my money back and I'm going to get out of here. But if you've been up through like 6 or 7 levels of this, contributed hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, and you've already kind of had the what we call a continuance commitment to it, now you don't want to leave because you're already invested. All your friends are in it. But if you knew off the bat that, hey, you're now a believer that Lord Zeno is bad, it might be a harder to be kind of blunt, sell. So again, who is keeping the power in the religion? Why are they doing it? How is that influencing their power within the sect, but also how the sect as itself might influence political power
yeah.
or cultural norms for that matter, which I think we all feel, at least in the United States, how religion and different religions can affect cultural norms and values and what we have to live with or work against as well.
Well, it becomes a powerful tool to sell points. If you invest a lot of belief in the religion as the point of reference with ethics, then it becomes something that you can use kind of to argue anything. And so that's something that you would consider in your book of whether it's a positive or negative force. It could be either. A lot of times
Could be
people are very
both.
jaded. It could be both. You could have the good, normal people just doing whatever, and then the people who are about to do something evil, and they might have different ways of following different faiths or this literally the same
Same
one
faith.
in different ways. You can have, and this goes back to having the religion for reflect with your characters. If you are in a polytheistic society, then it may be, and a lot of times, like you get this from D&D as well, but as you may have religions with polytheism where you look to certain gods throughout the course of the year, but often in fantasy, you'll have them attached to one or the other specifically for their type of magic or their place in the class system. And that allows you to differentiate certain character traits a little bit while delivering a little information about the world itself and
I
what
would
they value.
say that a religion that is somewhat comparable to having kind of those patron gods that you would turn to for certain aspects of them that I can think of more recently is in Eastern Africa, the Yoruba tribes. They
Yeah.
have Loas to whom they pray, and that's some through the trade of enslaved peoples and through that channel through the Caribbean and into the American South became sort of the roots also for types of magic like Santeria and hoodoo and voodoo and voodoo and that kind of stuff. But like literally having different loas or different aspects that you might be able to pray to for favor over weather or over different types of spiritual conditions. And that is kind of something that's an idea of that. And same idea when you have polytheism, different types of gods who have different aspects that they appeal to. So, one thing that comes up is also we're talking about how it affects society, but there are also literally social aspects within whatever religion you're building that are touchstones for building a religion that feels like one we might have in the real world. Do you want to talk a little bit about like or ritual plays into that too?
Maybe I'm trying to determine what you're asking. So, rituals in themselves, when I think of them from world building, I think of them as an opportunity for you to set things going on around them so that you get a sense of what their world is like, what their festivals are like, and the important moments. So, when I think about rituals, either you're doing a ritual to achieve a specific effect. So, from the neo-pagan viewpoint of that, it would be go to your altar, arrange the stuff, do the thing, which can be a personal or multiple people. But it can also have to do with rituals as at this point in the year, we eat turkey, or at this point of the year, we exchange gifts. At this point of the year, we dance around a pole. So
Well, in
there are
November
certain,
we just had on the first the Dia de los Santos, which is after Halloween, especially in like Latin and South America, where you go to the graves and pay respect to those who have died. Exactly. Like you have festivals you think of that come up all like in different parts of the calendar year.
yeah, and so in you that way you see general, this is our marking of time throughout the year of things that we would do anyway, but then it becomes tied into the religion and how that enacts in their life. You don't have to have religion to do that. People can have a harvest festival for no reason, of just because they're harvesting and this is a good time to get together and party because humans like to be social. But then you also look at how does ritual tell us what the important moments are in your life cycle. Not every society would need to celebrate being born necessarily. We do. Generally speaking, people will celebrate birthdays, but didn't always.
Jehovah's
Um,
Witnesses still don't.
yeah. And then other important moments in your life cycle. Now, at what age do you have these moments? We celebrate marriages more than we used to, a lot more in some cases if you have money. But then you may have the coming of age rituals. At what point does someone reach adulthood and why that moment? Why that year? Why is it 12 or 15 or 18 or 21? When is it and what does that mean for other things? What are the other things beyond that point in the life cycle when you've hit? So you look at those rituals as the recurring events of the year or lives and filter that into your world building of, oh, what do we know about the society based off of what they celebrate and what they consider important to think about. Additionally, how do they meet each other? Like, how often are they meeting to talk? So I'm going to go back to Earthsea because I don't want to talk about Christianity anymore. They tend to have a gathering once a week. Now, their gathering isn't so that someone can tell them what to think. Their gathering is so that someone in the community can bring up something that they want to talk about. And they will get up there, they'll talk about it, and everyone will interrogate them. So they will have a hearty discussion about the Earthseed verses or about this other idea that they have. And their point is that we are always active engagement, having active engagement in our world and looking at what's going on around us. And that's their meeting. Um,
I was going to say when John Oliver did his sort of exploration of the IRS and its ability to tax or not religions, he applied and made sort of his show audience his religious sect. I forget what he called himself, but it worked. The IRS approved it because one of the tenets was for IRS to consider something a religion, it had to meet regularly. And so they meet once a week on Sundays at his studio. Now it's Saturdays, but on Sundays at the time in his studio in New York City. But it is a meeting time for like-minded individuals to be in fellowship. And that's part of a religion. It's not usually just the feast day or the big holiday, but
yeah.
usually there's regular in-person meeting that strengthens those bonds as a community.
Yeah, that it helps you feel more connected to each other, to have the option to come together and talk about your feelings about this thing that's slightly or largely more than yourself. Okay, now this is from Orange is the New Black, where they were creating a new religion around one of the people in the prison because she does not speak because she has a stutter, but she used to be in a cult, so she knows how to do this stuff. And she started her own little cult, and then they created their own rituals, among which included going outside once a day and absolutely screaming things that were frustrating, which I think is very nice. But then if you took that to some of the more like the neo-pagan stuff, it might be like we need to be outside so many times per day to commune with nature or like take a beat, take a breath, to do these things. So like what about the religion encourages them to do certain things to keep their faith going or keep their connections going?
One other thing I like to think about when you're talking about rituals or parts of the religion is also we talked about rituals for when you come of age, but there are also rituals for what happens when there's life or death. There are certain types of ways you prepare the body both before and after death or say goodbye. I think that's very intrinsic and part of religion because religion is supposed to ask that question of where do we come from, what may or may not have made us, and what happens after we're not here anymore and breathing. I think that's hard to think about what are the death rituals that might be involved in your religion or the preparation for losing
Yeah.
someone or being lost.
What needs to
So
happen before someone dies? If someone is dying, what rituals need to occur? I think it was the Hmong people who require a ritual to make sure that your soul is in your body when you die, or other cases like you have final rites prior.
yeah,
And then what is the proper treatment of the body afterwards? Going back to Earthseed, the proper treatment of the body is that you're going to be burned or buried and given to the nearby trees because the entire point is that we have to create the world in the way that we want, and therefore we're going to return to the earth and keep going in creation. Um,
coming from a monotheistic religion that isn't Christianity technically and stuff, but with Judaism, it's very different because they have to have the body interred within like 24 hours if possible. So sometimes even the range of the death rites could be a shorter or longer term depending on what the tenets of the religion are. Like you may have weeks to be able to prepare things or anoint it with oils or do whatever. You may be like, you need to do it in 72 hours because the reasons you come up with.
it doesn't even have to be like we think of Viking burials where you set someone on fire, you have the burial in the dirt, the way that we do with embalming, which is a little creepy. Please burn me. But then
Noted.
you have additional ones that I heard about burial by air, of meaning like putting you out somewhere where the birds will come get you.
We all know what happened to Walt Disney. It's not religious, but people have chosen in the past to be cryogenically frozen, at least in the last 25, 30
I
years. I
don't
mean,
know
that's
what
an
religion that
option.
would attach to, but it
Some
could
kind
be
of, we're going to
that kind of
be alive
religion
in the
of like
future again.
at this point you have to be cryogenically frozen as a part of your religion. So you decide what is important to them basically
I could
and
see
go
that as a
into it
tech bro
seeing
thing.
as a tech
Um,
pro religion. Yeah.
yeah, I could.
Um,
So there's thinking about how you integrate it. I guess, and you mentioned it a little bit because we talked about if things got more culty and or the sort of nascent, it had the potential to become a cult and orange and the new black. So when does a religion or a subsect of a religion kind of splinter off into cult territory. That's something that I think about a lot because cults are in the news a lot. People keep making them. There are religions that are technically recognized by the government now that's, may not be able to beat the cult rap, and maybe they shouldn't. I see you Scientology where you have your underlings sign up for 1 billion years of servitude to the Sea Org, etc. What do you think about Midnight when you think about like a cult as opposed to a more organized religion?
Think of a few things, and you can add on to this
Yeah.
because I'm not a scholar of cults in any way. I have some books that I need to dive into, but I think of a few things that involve drawing people in. So there's always that early period of love bombing. As you said, they never give you the full story first. They want you to feel connected to them first. They want you to feel at home and comfortable. And now that could be any religion. Maybe they are that chill. But from that point forward, you're starting to reveal things, and then there will be some way to keep you there where you're being cut off from others, and then your labor at some point will be exploited, and there is almost always a central figure who this cult is focused around. As I'm saying this, that makes me think that movie where she goes off to this, she loses her sister and then they go
Oh,
off to a cult,
Midsummer.
Midsummer,
Yeah.
of like there wasn't really a central figure, but it was still a cult. So I guess that's the outlier. But usually there is a central figure in a cult that will be the focus for them. And then often you have this focus on the other world where you're going to do something. Your people are eventually, once you finally know everything, you're going to ascend or get taken by a comet or get raptured of
Yeah.
we're not going to be in this world anymore.
That makes me
And
think of
it's off
Knitting
in
Cult
space.
Lady. And she's like,
Yeah.
all cults promise space. They just don't get there. But in real life, they promise it because even Elon Musk, but they promise it because it's such a far-fetched a field, they'll never achieve it. But the followers don't know that. So you can kind
It's
of
a
keep
little
them
less
dangling.
silly than it's a way that they can defer indefinitely the payoff
Gratification.
without saying, "Oh, well, God screwed up. We're
Yeah.
not going this year." So I was
Keeping
going to
them,
say I don't want to say maliciously, but cults tend to be malicious. So
cults are
maliciously
malicious.
doing what some people maybe be doing on accident of
Yeah.
deferring the expectation on purpose because they want to keep you there.
They want to keep your money and they want to keep their control. And you are right that most cults I can think of have a central leader or at least start with one. Scientology starts with L. Ron Hubbard and now it's David Miscavige. Yeah, I'm calling it a cult. I don't care if they were able to infiltrate the IRS to get it to do what it wanted. But there's also, I think they call themselves the People's Temple, the group that was in Guyana down in the 70s under Jim Jones, who is where we got the expression drink the Kool-Aid from, because
Yeah.
when everything fell apart, they drank the cyanide-laced Kool-Aid to, ascend, i.e., die. So they wouldn't have their cult dissembled. It doesn't necessarily have to be as overtly, it sounds weird to say it, religious or promising spiritual like rewards in the next life. I hate to bring them up, but it is on my mind because they were very in the news. Was the Nix Swim cult, however you
Yeah.
pronounce it, that Allison Mack was a part of with Keith Raniere was more promising, I guess, trying to promise like enlightenment and female empowerment in this world. But at the end of the day, Rainier was still the central figure of that. So you've got Jim Jones, you've got Keith Raniere, you've got L. Ron Hubbard, very splinter section of the Mormon Church, which was the FLDS, just those Latter-day Saints that were split off in a compound in like Texas. Warren Jess was their cult leader, and David Koresh with the Branch Davidians in Waco in the 1990s. So you're
Yeah.
seeing a few patterns here that mostly the main leaders, even if they may have essentially female handmaidens who soften their image, like Allison Mack, I see you there, is a central leader. He's usually a man, and he leads with what we call in psychology often the dark triad of personality and the dark triad of leadership, which is a mix of narcissism, and I'll get to each what they mean, Machiavellianism and
Yeah.
psychopathy. So narcissism, we talk about it a lot because it's become sort of a buzzword on TikTok, but it is that antisocial personality disorder subtype where you're so inwardly focused on yourself and your own gratification that you use others and see relationships as at best transactional, where everybody is an object to be used for your greater gratification. Machiavellianism comes from the idea of, Machiavelli, the prince, where you're doing things and you keep telling yourself, no matter what I do, no matter how awful, the ends are going to justify the means. I'm sure somehow in his deep, most warped mind, Jim Jones thought that it's better to kill us all and not be taken alive and be just taken apart as a church than to die. Dying is better than being like essentially torn apart as a congregation, and try to justify the means that way for something that horrific. And then psychopathy, which is usually, violent behavior or, criminal behavior. Sociopathy is usually defined as criminal behavior that's white collar type crime. Psychopathy is flat out willingness to hurt others. And if you think about someone like Keith Rainier, where he was doing things that were violent physically and sexually, I'll put a disclaimer on the podcast that this does talk a little bit about cults and that kind of control. But sexually abusing the women under his control in his cult. Like the psychopathy can be a lot of that type of abuse or food access and restriction. Even within Scientology, those who are the lower tier members who work for the Sea Org, they're denied rest. They have to work like 12-hour shifts. They get paid, if they're paid at all, like literally pennies. It's also financial abuse. So there's that leader who may be very charismatic, and that's part of the narcissism, brings you in with their personality and their grandiosity and their promises, tells you it's all going to be justified, but at the end of the day is also hurting you. And then within the cults, you become isolated, you become only associated with other cult members. If you leave, there's that threat of ostracism, and then all of a sudden they have your money. Often in something like Scientology or NXIVM, they have your secrets because you've confessed them to them as either collateral or part of thetan therapy and e-meter reading in Scientology. So no, not only do you have no money, no resources, and nowhere to go because all your friends are still in the cult and they won't talk to you if you leave, you
Yeah.
also have them could exploit you or use what you know about them from therapy or sessions together or prayer or intercession against you legally. So that's also a reason why even once you're in, you're too deep to get back out. And they work very hard at information and suppression of getting information. It was easier for groups to do that pre-internet, but they could still cut you off or get you to think with a lot of indoctrination and that love bombing you were talking about earlier, midnight, and the thought terminating cliches of don't think about it, just keep focusing on the leader to get you from leaving, from even questioning the wanting to leave, saying even
Yeah.
to yourself that you're there voluntarily. It makes me think of, I don't know if you ever saw it because it's a billion years ago, but there was a Simpsons episode where the Simpsons join a cult. And it, honestly, Homer's the last one to get into the cult. Like he's in it, but he's not bought in. They're like, he's just got a strong mind. And they finally just sing na 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 leader because he's been singing the Batman theme song in his head for days.
Yeah.
He's like, na 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 leader. I love Batman. I mean, I love the leader, but it's still that idea that they had to move to the cult territory on a farm and kind of just be sat there away from Springfield to even start being assimilated into the cult, giving them things they thought they wanted as a love bombing stage.
Yeah. Being separated from your family, your friends, your society does help. A couple of things pop to mind as you're describing that. And I think the first was that we just rewatched Midnight Mass of something that was already a religion. I think hits a lot of these points of almost becoming, well, maybe literally becoming a cult because they end up
Of
drinking poison.
vampires. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a vampire cult. They use their former Monsignor and ends up being so much more charismatic now that he's
Oh,
young, that
yeah.
he can draw people in, that he can give them their miracles, and he is hurting them as they're going along. Of like a woman literally loses her baby, they ruin their lives, and then they all die.
They all
So
burst into flamey flames.
yeah. And then
Sunlight.
the other thing that pops into my mind, which everyone should read if they have a strong enough stomach, is You Weren't Meant to Be Human, where we have an Appalachian cult made of worms and flies. And people are out of the way in the Appalachian area and they follow these worms and flies and do what they say and bring them bodies to eat. And you're not supposed to be having associations outside of their hive, their collective. And it makes it so much harder to get out because they're drawing from people who are already at their worst point anyway.
And that's a big part of it is people are like, well, how could you be so dumb to join a cult? But they specifically target people who are loners, people who are feeling vulnerable. There's a reason Scientology was so easy to get started, especially and really get its, pardon the pun, sea legs by glomming onto people in Los Angeles who are trying to become actors and getting onto people like Travolta Cruz before they became super famous or as famous as actors. Because what's a lower position than a job where all you do is get rejected and the odds of succeeding at all are like minuscule and promising not just fellowship, but maybe chances at connections or like with God help us all, NXIVM, women who really want to have a way to feel empowered when society as a whole, as a patriarchy makes women feel often very depowered, but also
Yeah.
getting women who were isolated online or in fandom because some of the people who were filtered there, unfortunately, were fans from Smallville. They weren't ones we had known, but they were ones who were fans, I think, of the Chloe and Ollie relationship, and one of them who had ended up being her fan and personal assistant for Mac first. And so those are women who were probably lonely. They were online a lot, and this gave them a feeling of fellowship. So yeah, you get people who are lonely and are already semi-isolated and are kind of in a wounded space, and then you love bomb them. By the time they realize things are not quite right or this isn't what they signed up for, it's often just too late, you know? And then there's also that thing where you have to break through the cognitive dissonance. It's very hard to accept that you've been doing something where your beliefs were misguided or you were taken advantage of and admit it. And so sometimes it's just so much more painful to make that break and be like, this doesn't make sense and just keep adhering to
Yeah.
it because then you don't lose what you've already invested or you don't have to question conflicting beliefs with like, this is what the cult says it does, but now that I'm here, it's really bad and it's exploitative. So there's a lot of
Said
pain and
the
issues
knitting
within that.
cult lady says don't go undercover in a cult
Yeah, it won't
because
work.
you think you're too smart to have this work on you because they're very good at what they do. If they know what they're doing, that they're trying to draw people in so they can't leave, won't want to leave, and then won't want to be able to admit that they had been tricked, that they
Well, it's
changed their
humiliating. It's
mind. Yeah.
embarrassing. Everybody wants to feel smart, and then admitting that you were tricked by something like that, that organized, it just makes you feel bad. There's not only that, but then you know you're gonna leave if you had the means and not everybody else you knew was now in the cult. You're gonna get a million I told you so's, and who wants to go to that either? It's a really complicated issue. I think one thing with cults is if you're gonna write stories, especially horror stories, tend to deal with cults because they are creepy, because they end up being abusive most of the time.
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of their definition. But like people didn't get into them because they were dumb. They got into them because life is hard and we
Yeah.
all get beaten down often, more often than not. And they reached out to us and were talented con artists who are preying on people like that in their lowest moments of need. And that's really why that is a horrific thing if you're going to write about it as a horror, is that they found people at their lowest moment and promised them kindness and fellowship, but the cost turns out to be high. In horror, it's you're worshiping an old one. You're all going to become worms. You're going to have to kill yourself at 72 by jumping off a cliff, etc. But is that any more barbaric or terrifying than literally what happened with the Heaven's Gate cult that killed themselves to theoretically join the Hale-Bopp comet, or
Yeah.
what happened with Advanced Davidians having a fatal shootout with the federal government? Like, in the end, they
Yeah, they don't
usually don't
start
end
out with the
well.
Kool-Aid. That's not their first
No,
volley of like, would you like to join us? We're going to kill ourselves. That's not where it starts.
it's real
Um,
gradual by the time you realize it's like a frog boiling moment for
yeah.
sure. Well, as we wrap up with religion, is there anything else you wanted to add on such a cheery, we're all being slowly boiled kind of note, Midnight, or anything else you want to reflect on that within the
I mean,
greater
we spent
context of
a
world
lot of time
building?
talking about the cultist stuff, but I think a good takeaway is that a lot of this does have to do with power and power that people can have over each other. Then within your world, depending power literal gods may have, because if you're in fantasy, they could be real or they could
Yeah.
not be real, and you get to make that choice of whether they're going to be around. I would suggest that you don't talk about them vaguely and then someone who is one of the characters turns out to be a god because that's a power scaling issue. But if you're thinking about folklore and how they're trying to make sense of their world, one thing that I want people to think about is how weird stories are that we tell about religion and how they end up being so metaphorical, and then we try to take them literally, of like it can be the story of how humanity came to be because someone lured them out of the trees. How did they get in the trees? I don't know. Or stories where I'm trying to think of the weirdest ones. Like you just can Inanna
I
stories
hate
from
going
Inanna in
to the
Sumeria. I was telling you some of
yeah.
them last night of, oh, let's just get this other god drunk and I'll steal some of his powers and then go down to hell. And my sister is gonna absolutely brutalize me because she knows I'm trying to steal her domain. The stories that you tell about things, that their mythology is very interesting, and it's all about them interpreting the world and organizing the world. It's there as a layer into your world building. It's not something in itself, but as you're building, you can kind of think about what kind of religion would jive with the system that they're creating and go back and forth between it of how is the religion shaping them? How did they use the religion to get what they wanted out of life, etc.
Think if I had a note for it, I think there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of just individual variation, even without with small parts of the same religion on paper. Like even if you think about how many Protestant denominations there are in the United States, it would be like, what? But also I think that you need to bring it to that nuance level of what it means to your personal character, because if it's there, it should have some sort of bearing on the character's life. They don't have to be the most religious person to ever religious, but it's going to affect, like you say, their power structure, some of their rituals, maybe what they're into, what their family's into, what they value, or what they value as a reflection to how they wish the religion wasn't so predominant, or maybe isn't predominant enough in their particular area and like political systems. Like it's all going to have ultimately an effect on the character, and it's going to be fine gradations of it than I think people think sometimes. And I think
Yeah,
one way, like you pointed out, to understand that at least more in human is to look at human history and to look at what's happened with just certain religions within our do not graft your religion onto a real religion. Like you have to make
yeah,
one up and not just pick and choose. Be like, I'm just gonna take all of, Astrozorianism for me. But what I am saying is you can see how sects develop, how you have schisms, how you have changes in the liturgy, how you have religious wars or crusades or terrorism attacks. And I'm thinking again, when I actually say that about Northern Ireland more than anything else, of like places that are similar, but the cousins and the religions are fighting with each other. If you look at how history grows, you can see again how it's all these gradations and shades and little changes that all of a sudden over time
yeah,
become much bigger ones. And I think that's what I would encourage if you don't have ideas for your religion, also look at history of even your own religion that you may be practicing currently and be how did mine grow? Where did it start? How did it have this many other branches that I don't even think about? And gives you a scale for how that can be so nuanced and have such a journey over time. Because a lot of religions, we're looking at time frames of hundreds of years, thousands of years. I mean, some religions are newer. I know Mormonism isn't super
yeah,
old, but like a lot of them, even if you go back to Islam, is what, 1500, 1400 by now? Like, and
yeah,
that's one of the younger ones. You can look at history in a time frame for religions that can be thousands of years. So think of how much can change and branch off and mutate and scatter and evolve over 6 or 7 thousand years. And that's kind of the scale you're looking at broadly, but then how does that become personalized to your character and motivate them? Because it comes
yeah.
often back to goals, motivation, and conflict.
And then going from there further, if you're trying to think about how the countries in your world evolve, culture and religion, particularly if you have it set up well enough, then it can be a unifying factor more than you would think. As I think of for Hinduism in particular, created a class system that ended up being a unifying, stabilizing factor in China, Confucianism, and the way that filtered into their state exams created a unifying creation over time that meant that what we think of China now had a very long history because of that. And so it may be the reason that things fracture, but it may also be the reason that something lasted for a very long time.
I mean,
It can
there's
be
a
a very
reason,
destructive force in cults, but it can also be a very productive force. It has a lot of
or it can be
stuff that you can do
both.
with it.
Because when you're
Yeah,
mentioning it,
both.
it made me think about Catholicism and like the conquistadors who did horrible things to the indigenous people, awful things. But at the same time, the reason parts of Latin and South America are so cohesive now, and most of them share a common language
Yeah,
and a lot of common traditions and a lot of commonality, is because that being broadly often Catholic. There are other sects, there's other cultures that get in there as well in smaller pockets, but the overwhelming culture of most of South America is Catholic. And even if you go to Brazil, that's Portuguese Catholics. But it's still like that did unify a region for hundreds of years and still does under a very similar adopted but still ideology. And for good or ill, it can have a very unifying effect in all sorts of places. And I think there's
Yeah,
also that nuance of like religion bad, but yeah, but there are aspects to it and aspects of how it has good things or bad things, or what the power, as you like to say, what is it being used for, that really
yeah,
is determining how the tool is put out there, because religion can be a tool and it can be a good tool or a bad tool. It really depends on who's the gatekeeper at the top of the heap dictating the agenda for it. Similarly with cults, but that's almost always narcissists who are only using it for bad agendas, because
yeah.
yikes. So, that's what I had for now. Any last thoughts?
I guess my last thought is go out there and research some weird stories from other cultures and have fun with it because the more you know about religion in general, the more you can creatively move into your own rather than just, as you say, grafting onto something
Useful
of your, if you, once you get the vibe of how these early stories run and the way that people have interacted, then you can start vibing with it and seeing how it works and read in your genre and see how people handle it because getting that world building into the story is a
animal
whole different day.
integration. Well, I thank you all for listening to us. We'll be back in a couple of 3 weeks with something new, which we will definitely figure that out before we record. And again, we will be hosting the online forum class for how to write a holiday-based story. Probably start around the 15th of December. But if you're interested in learning about how to sign up for it, you can email us at info@otherlands-editing.com. That's info@otherlands-editing.com. And until then, we will see you in a couple weeks with a new episode. Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon. And in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.